There you go. Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about utility versus component design libraries. Now, what's the difference, right? Utility libraries are something more where we're still going to be utilizing classes. We're going to be calling CSS, and it comes with some default design patterns that we don't necessarily need to actually write the CSS for. That is called Tailwind CSS. And in Tailwind CSS, if we actually go over to Tailwind's main website, we can see how by adding just a couple of lines of code, they're completely changing this person's profile image, right? Let's see if they continue going. So they're changing the font color. This is just a quick demonstration of how by adding just a few classes or a few class names, the entire display of this one individual's image is being altered, right? And that's kind of the power behind utility libraries. They're supposed to be more flexible. They are taking away some control because they're essentially doing a lot of CSS for you. But at the same time, they are also maintaining quite a they're also maintaining quite a bit of flexibility, meaning they're not just overriding all of your CSS and taking the ability for you to come back and change it. They're just simply giving you a combination of different classes that you can put together to make some dynamic designs. Well, if this is utility, what does component mean? Well, component is still going to give you some really good reactive components, right? But it's also giving you a whole component of code, right? It's not just telling you, hey, add these classes to these things or to these divisions or these different paragraph tags. Instead, it's saying, if you want to utilize this, you need to, one, install all of React Bootstrap. And then in order to use it, you're going to have to utilize this entire component. And the component that I'm referencing to is the accordion, which is being imported from React Bootstrap. All right, so we can tell this is JSX code. It gets imported. It's inside of a function. It gives you a return statement. These also have classes at the very bottom. So if we scroll down to the very bottom of any of these elements in the components, they show you a couple of classes or element types that you can actually change or utilize to alter the component that's being rendered. Something really cool that I like using from this is inside of layout, they have this grid layout. I really like wrapping all of my apps inside of a container from React Bootstrap. And the reason for that is that it makes all of my sizing very reactive. As you can see, the container is squeezing already on its own, and it has a lot of flexibility in changing and moving things around to ensure that your application doesn't leak out of the screen or that the content within your application stays within the screen itself. All right, so they also have forms that you can utilize. Forms are very useful from React Bootstrap, or at least I like their forms. There's a bunch of things in React Bootstrap that you can utilize as well. Now, React Bootstrap is more of a, hey, this is what I'm providing for you. And if you don't really like what I'm providing for you, you're going to have to make it yourself. Whereas Tailwind CSS is, hey, you could utilize a multitude of these tools to create this example, right? So utility, it's giving you the tools. Components, it's giving you a final product. It's saying, hey, this is what I have. I hope you like it. And if you don't, then make it yourself, right? So that's the difference between the two. Now we have two NPM projects here. We have our React Bootstrap. We have our React Tailwind project. In the first portion of our lecture, we're going to be concentrating on Tailwind, making Tailwind actually adapt to a Vue and React project. And then we're going to see how we can apply some of these classes to utilize them. Now, keep in mind, we don't have enough time to actually a deep dive into every single class that there is within Tailwind. And obviously, when it comes to CSS or almost anything that has to do with styling, it is all scenario basis. So in order for you to really get familiar with this, with either a library or a component design, you just have to continue to create projects where both of them are being utilized. And at that point, it's just a rinse and repeat process. The more you utilize it and the more variety of projects you create, the more familiarized you'll be with the actual tool. So with that said, let's kick this off. I'm going to go ahead and change directory into my Tailwind project. And inside of my Tailwind project, I'm going to run npm install because I can see that I have package.json. I don't have a package-lock.json, and I also don't have my node modules. So that tells me that I haven't installed this application inside of my machine yet. So I run npm install. There's those node modules. And there's the package-lock.json. Well, now how do I actually put this together so that I can work with it? Well, most public libraries or anything that you want to utilize will have a getting started or a documentation thing that will be very, very useful. So here it tells me, hey, I want you to install Postgres, to install Tailwind. And here it gives me, hey, this is how you do it with the CLI. And then it tells me, here's what the Tailwind config looks like. And all of this looks like it would be super easy to apply. But we got to realize that we are working with frameworks here. And specific frameworks may have some sort of edge cases that we also need to consider in order to make Vite work properly with Tailwind CSS. So you could click on framework guides and then click on Vite. And inside of Vite, well, it gives me a separate command. It says if you're utilizing Vite with React, Vite with Vue, or Svelte, you can follow each one of these guides for installing it. This is awesome. This gives me almost step-by-step how to actually install everything. I'm going to go ahead and put it in the Yankee questions. And now I'm going to go into installing this application. So here's how to create it. We already have created a project, so I don't need to necessarily run this portion up top. I'm going to come down here, and here it tells me this is how you're going to install Tailwind CSS. So I want you to npm install -d Tailwind CSS post CSS auto prefixer. All right, so that's a lot of things that I would not have assumed that we needed to actually install. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and paste it. Here we have npm install -d Tailwind CSS post auto prefixer. So I run that, it starts installing it inside of my project. There's this npx Tailwind CSS init-p. This has to do with npx projects. So that doesn't really apply to me. Only this part applies to me. Or I may have to actually run this here. And it's dependencies, the generate your Tailwind CSS and post CSS config files. Let's take a look here. So now I see vconfig. Let me take a look at source. It doesn't look like I have these files that it's referencing here. I'm going to run that second line of code just in case. I'm pretty sure this doesn't apply to me. But I'm going to run it to see what it does. Oh, I was completely wrong. So now when I ran npx tailwind init-p, well, running that created a tailwind.config.js, which is something that I was looking for. And it also created a post css.config.js, which is here. So now I have both of these available, these files available, and Tailwind should be able to work properly moving forward. All right, let's take a look at the next configuration here. So configure your template paths. Add the path to all your template files in your tailwind.config.js. Okay, awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and come down to my tailwind.config.js. Here it gives me an example of what we would want it to look like. And so here we can see it utilizing regex. It's saying inside of the source directory, there may be other folders or there may just be one folder, but we want to iterate through all of the directories inside of source and files inside of source. And any file that has JS, TS, JSX, or TSX will have this applied. So this is actually exactly what I want. So I'm just going to copy that. And I'm going to go ahead and paste it inside of my file. All right, so now it tells me, hey, I want you need to add the tailwind directives to your CSS. Add the add tailwind directives to each tailwinds layer to your source / index.css file. All right, so I copy this here. I'm gonna come over. I'm gonna delete all of the CSS that I already have so that it doesn't get in the way. Come to index.css, and there's my directives. All right, so I have at tailwind / base, and so on. All right, so it's giving me an unknown at role. That's okay. We'll see if this is able to function here shortly. All right, so now it tells me you can go ahead and do npm run dev, and you could run this for your function of app. So I'm going to take this, come over to app.jsx, and in app.jsx, I'm just going to change it to that return statement there of the h1. All right. Let's see our project now. I'm going to npm run dev, and I'm going to open up my project. All right, so we can see that that's not regular text, right? If I were to have, this is all just hello world. I never underlined it. This is just supposed to be an H1 tag, but you can see that the font size is different. Here we see text 3XL, which is a font size for the text. We can see that the font is bold, and you can see that it also has the underline class. So this is all coming straight from Tailwind, being able to alter our React project with some styling. Well, where does this come from? When we installed Tailwind, inside of node modules, somewhere in there is all of the Tailwind CSS code that we actually need to be able to render. So this isn't all imaginary stuff. There's a reference to a massive compilement of actual CSS files. And all we're doing is borrowing their classes, essentially. Somebody went through inside of this utility library, and they just continuously compiled class names that were useful, that people can utilize. And now whenever I install it into my project, I can borrow their class names and utilize them. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding the installment of Tailwind CSS into a React project? Let's hear it, Owen.
Yeah, so I'm assuming for like other projects that you want to look unique compared to the like default, you would actually go into like the Tailwind's website and then pick out how you'd want that to look, or like your, I guess, I don't know what to call it, but to make it look unique.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, if you wanted to make something look unique, I think you could use a combination of all the Tailwind CSS components that are out there, or you could make your own CSS. There's nothing against making your own CSS. I think the power that really comes with Tailwind CSS or utility and component libraries is just speed, right? We could definitely make this font size, right? I could go to Google Fonts, grab the font class that I need, bring it in, just underline this and change all this information. But the flexibility of having utilities is that now I did it in a matter of seconds by adding 3 separate classes. Does that answer your question, Owen?
My question was more, I framed that question really bad. How would you like pick out? I'm sure there's different templates and tailwinds to choose from. How would you like pick out a different one?
Ah, got it. Okay, awesome. I think I understand your question better now. I apologize. So now, if we take a look here, there's a playground that we can actually go and apply all these different Tailwind components. You could grab a template. I don't necessarily think we want to grab templates here. But the important parts come down here where we start looking into customization for screens, base styles. There's layout for aspect ratios and different things that we can do with Z-index. Here's Flexbox. And you would just essentially scroll down to this drop-down menu, look for the tool that you want to apply, select it, and it'll give you an example. All right, so here's the example of how we would actually utilize the class. And then it tells you what the class actually does on the right-hand side.
Gotcha. You'll have to play with that. Thank you.
Of course. Sam?
So if we use the class name in React, that kind of takes away the class name, correct? When we use it for Tailwind, and then let's say you want to do more styling with CSS because the Tailwind styling is not good enough, or you just want to put more CSS into it. Would you just have to utilize like ID then, because class name is already taken by React or
Yeah.
by Tailwind? I'm sorry.
That's a great question. So if you wanted to overwrite or alter this text, remember we have cascading style sheets, right? So right now, the very first things that are being applied is everything that's coming from Tailwind. But I can still add my class. You'll see that that didn't change anything because my class doesn't exist as of now. And now we can actually go into app CSS, make my class, and I could do something like, hey, in this class, I want there to be a font size of, I don't know, 23 Vimin. All right, and let's go ahead and, did I name it correctly? Let's see, app.jsx. Let me make sure I have the correct spelling on both. And let's say that we also want something like font weight. Let's just go with 100. Interesting. So far it doesn't look like it's changing it. Let's take a look at the console so that we could see the application of it and why it's not changing it. So here is my computed elements here. There we go. And let me go ahead and run the selector tool. All right, so there we have our border bottom, border styles. Font size has remained at 30 pixels. I tried adding a font weight, but it looks like it didn't allow me to add the font weight. So it looks like that's getting trumped. Let me see if I could add this inside of index CSS. And maybe this will make a difference. Likely not. Okay, so that did make a difference. All right, so if I put it in, if you want to write your own class that will essentially overwrite what's coming in from Tailwind, you can still do so, right? You just need to make sure that it's the last CSS that gets iterated through. So in this case, the last CSS that gets iterated through is my dash class. So app CSS, which is surprising to me. I thought app CSS would have been the last CSS to get processed. So app CSS gets processed first, then index CSS starts getting processed. Index CSS brings in all the Tailwind components and all of the different Tailwind classes that are available. But now there's a class that I want to apply myself. So I create my class and I just add it inside of the class name by putting a space. So every time there's a space in between class names, that signifies that this is carrying multiple classes. Did that address your question, Sam?
Yep. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Okay, awesome. It doesn't seem like there are any other questions. I think the installment is going to be something that's very useful for us. I mean, it has it step by step. I sent out the link to how to install with the Vite through our Yankee Questions channel. So later on, when you're working on your applications, You know, if you have something that's maybe like a Google Sheet or even a Google Doc or a notes document where you're keeping important links or things that are useful, please put that link there. You'll never know when you run into an interview, front-end design, where they'll hand you a project and say, hey, we want you to utilize Tailwind CSS specifically to design this project and make it look nice, which is not an uncommon project to take home. So please get familiar with utility libraries. I think in industry standard, when it comes to utility versus component libraries, most places utilize utility over component libraries. And that's because of the flexibility that comes with it. All right. Well, now we got all of our CSS installed. We can actually dive into utilizing our CSS. All right. So let's go ahead and do so. And actually, before we dive into that, let's go ahead and take a quick break. I want to make sure that everybody was able to swallow the installment of CSS, especially for the people that are following along. Currently, it's 9:26. Let's come back at 9:30 and continue on with our lecture, everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone. So now let's go into actually applying a little bit of CSS for everything that we actually want to utilize here, right? Let's go ahead and create a simple, nice button here that we're just going to say, hey, I want you to click me. Now for this button, we're going to talk about the different sorts of padding, the different sorts of borders, and how to apply margin. Now, all of this is very much it's going to be pretty straightforward, I believe. And it's just try to think about it in short words. All we're going to be looking at is this click me button. Let me go ahead and comment out that H1. All right, so there's my click me button. If I refresh it, we can see that it's a button because if I hover over it, it turns my hand into a pointer, right? So my clicker turns into a pointer. But we can't really see much of the button. It's not giving me a, hey, this is what I want the button to look like, right? And that's okay. That's default from Tailwind because Tailwind is assuming that we want to design this button and we don't want to utilize the default design from the browser. So I'm just going to go ahead and utilize class names here. And I'm going to start utilizing class names to show what our border is. So let's go ahead and grab that button and take a look at our computed elements, right? So here's my computed elements of margin, border, padding, and the button itself. Well, if I wanted to add padding to all sides, I can say, hey, padding -2. And now you can see that all of my padding is being implemented at 8 pixels. Now this is reactive to some extent. So some of these units of measurements, even though we're applying 2, as the screen gets smaller, we can add immediate queries and we can add some different classes so that we can ensure that this gets smaller as the screen gets smaller or it gets bigger as the screen gets bigger. Well, if we could do that with padding, we can also do that with border. Let's say I want my border to be 3. All right. So now I have padding, border, and then finally let's do maybe a margin. And I think this didn't like it because it's not a common number. There you go. So it's going by common numbers only. So here we have a padding of 2, which evaluates to 8. We have a border of 4, which evaluates to 4. And then we have a margin of 2, which is the spacing on the outside, which again evaluates to 8. All right, I can make this 6 on the margin. You can see that it gets bigger. So now we have 24 on the outside. No idea why this 4 evaluates to 4, but this 2 evaluates to 2. So that's one thing that we could definitely dive into. It looks like border has a number per meaning, whereas 6 has a amplification going on there, right? It looks like it's 4 times 6 gives us 24. So I'm assuming that if I make this 4, it would be 16. There you go. So that one's being multiplied times 4. And then we have 2, which is also being multiplied times 4. Right, so there we were able to add padding to all sides, borders to all sides, and margins to all sides. A couple of hands went up and they went back down. Let's go ahead and open it up for questions. Let's hear from Juan.
Yeah, for border, you said it was 3 didn't work as a what now? Common numbers? What was that?
Yes, that's correct. So if I put 3, that's an odd number. I don't like that. So it looks like they named all of their class conventions behind only common numbers, or excuse me, not common.
Even numbers?
Even numbers. There you go.
Gotcha. All right, thank you.
Of course. And it actually looks like 4 works, but 6 doesn't. Use as 5, so it leaves us with the options of 4 and 2. All right, so we could definitely look into the documentation for each one of these to figure out exactly which parameters they'll take in. But if we get the class showing up here, and we can see how we can apply them with their specific numbers. There's just different classes that can be applied, and it looks like they have different parameters or numerical values that you can utilize as well. All right, any other questions? Okay, well, let's change this, right? Let's say that I just wanted to have on top. I just want a padding on top, and I only want my margin to be applied to the top. All I need to do is add a T next to the M and next to the P, as in Papa. And that closed everything so that my padding is only on top and my margin is only showing up on top. How do I do that with the border? Well, it's actually border dash T dash 4. And now we only have the border showing up on top. We could also go into left and right, all right? So we could do something like this. Let's say I want my left and right. So I want border, or excuse me, my padding X, because the X axis is left and right, to be 5. Okay, so that works in padding. I want my padding Y, which is top to bottom, to be 1. So that worked as well. And then I want my border overall to be 2. There you go. There I have my border. I have my padding on left and right, and I have my padding on top and bottom. So it looks like I was wrong in regards to what components we can do here. I thought that they had a pattern of only even numbers, uh, but it might be deeper than that. We might have to dive into the documentation itself to see what parameters are acceptable for class names, because here in padding, we can definitely put 1 and 5, and it still works. All right. Any questions regarding the box model?
Actually, I got one. That 2, is that pixels or is that something else?
No, so this 2 is not pixels. I think it's just a relationship here. It looks like, oh no, in this case it is evaluating to pixels, 1 for 1. But you can see how this 1 and the 5 are not evaluating 1 for 1, right? So our padding X, which is left and right, we set it to 5, and that turned into 4 times 5 for 20 pixels. So it might just be depending on which one we're utilizing. In border, it's evaluating to pixels. In padding, it looks like it's multiplying that 5 or 1 times 4.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Demi?
So, just so I get this right, we don't have to import Tailwind in this because like that import statement up top is just app.css, but index.css actually has like the at Tailwind, like, so it's like, but it, like, how is it using the Tailwind? Is it because it's in like the dependency in the JSON file, or because it has a config file or something, or you see what I'm saying? Like you don't have to like actually import the Tailwind inside the app.jss and then inside the app.jsx where you're actually writing the Tailwind?
I see what you're referencing to, yes. But remember that app.jsx, right? All of app.jsx gets inserted into main.jsx. And here in main.jsx is where we
Index. Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense.
Awesome. All right. So we have main.jsx. We're still utilizing app. I don't need this configuration. There you go. All right, great. So we just covered our button and we took a look at the box model. The next thing we're going to take a look at is going to be our flex, or how we can actually use positioning arguments. So we're going to utilize a division. And this division is going to have, I don't know, maybe 3 child divisions. With the box class, let's multiply that times 3. All right, and let's make our box class here. It's going to be a height of 15 min, a width of 15 min. We're going to make sure that it has some borders as well. So let's just do a border on a solid red and make it 3 pixels just so we could see them. All right, so there's our boxes. Maybe we could make them a little bigger. And that's too big. And now they're just right. All right, there you go. So we have our boxes. There's 3 of them. And let's utilize our good old Tailwind CSS to try to add some flexibility to this division here. So I'm going to go ahead and go into class name. I'm going to just simply put flex. Well, by adding flex, it changed the division or the parent division, the container, to display flex. I can also specify, hey, I don't want you to utilize display flex row. I want you to be in flex column. All right, and there it is. We have our flex column. So here's flex row. What are you doing? Let's see. So display flex. I apologize. It looks like it's additional. We add flex column, which changes the direction of the flex. So this is the same thing as saying flex direction column or flex direction row. We can also do something like, hey, I want you to have a flex wrap. Right, so if we give our index CSS here, let's do a min width, and let's actually access the container. And in container, I'm going to give it a width of, I don't know, 50. Yeah, let's go with 50. And let's give that container class here. All right, so now we can see the flex wrap happening, right? We take off the flex wrap. There's the flex. There's definitely an overflow in these division elements. If we take a look here. Okay, you're not working the way I wanted you to. Let me go ahead and get rid of this stuff. All right, console's acting up. Let me go ahead and inspect it again. There you go. All right, so we open up the division class. So here's the container. Right, so the container is holding 2 of those boxes, but one of them is overflowing outboard. Here we can see the first box. Here's the second box, and then the third box. Well, when we add our flex wrap, this is just changing flex wrap to wrap. All right. Go ahead, Juan.
Sorry, just for my notes. You're doing this just for display purposes, right? Or for teaching purposes, right? To add the container in the regular CSS and then going back and doing Tailwind? Or do they sometimes jump between regular CSS and Tailwind CSS to like get the most, I guess, optimal thing?
You're definitely going to have a mixture of both. If you're looking for the most optimal and the most personalized thing, you're going to still utilize your own CSS, but you're also going to be applying Tailwind and utilities, right? So utilities are just for leveraging to help you, but you'll still need a lot of your own CSS here. All right. And let me go ahead and add a height component as well. And in this height component, I'm just going to make it 50 vmin. Excuse me, 50 VH. All right. Now, the reason why I added a height component here is because the next thing that I want to show us is how we can actually justify content. Well, I want to justify content center. We can see how I moved it a little bit to the right-hand side. Let me change this width here. Let's have it go to 100% instead. There you go. So we can see our justify content center. With that said, we can also do line, or excuse me, items center, it looks like. And that's for align items, right? That centers our division here. Right, because we're only using 50% of the view height, so it's centering at 15%. It's a little bit confusing there because it utilizes the first word of justify content for center, but then it utilizes the second word for align items for center, which tells me that align is probably being used for some other class somewhere inside of Tailwind. All right. And then what else we could do? We could do something like gap. And we can specify that we want gap X to be 2 pixels or 2. And there you go. And it creates a gap in between our different boxes. All right. So that's just how we can utilize our different sort of positioning or flex box that comes into play. Does anyone have any questions regarding how we grab the same flex? This is essentially the same exact flex that we did yesterday, right? Yesterday it looked something like this. It was container would have been having a class that looked like the display flex, justify content center, align items center, and gap of 5 vmin, let's say. All right, so this is essentially the same exact CSS that we would have been writing out. It's just that instead of writing all of this out, we just added simple class names into our container division. Does anyone have any questions over how we were able to accomplish this flex with CSS or with Tailwind? Let's hear from Owen.
Yeah, for your actual for your class name gap TACX TAC what was it 2? Is that 2 pixels or is that 2 vmin? What is the actual
Yeah, unit of measurement that's there.
yeah.
Take a look. So I can go into my console. All right, and I don't think it's gonna have an actual unit of measurement. No, it definitely does. Let's take a look here. Okay, so it's not giving me the information on that one. Maybe in here. So it turns into 0.5 rem. That's
Okay,
what
that leads me into another question. How would you be able to change the units? Because like yesterday, you're saying you want to kind of typically stick with the same unit of measurement for your entire spread or your style sheet. How would you change it? Say you want to use vmin for the entire sheet. How could you change that then? Utilizing would you just have to straight up use normal CSS, or would you be able to go utilize tailwinds to change that?
Yeah, if you want to change something that's coming in from Tailwind, you would have to use your own CSS. So I could go inside of index CSS, paste the class. So here it is. That's gap dash x dash 2. And I can say, hey, instead of doing that, I want you to have a gap of 2 vmin. And now mine is overriding what came in. So here's what comes in from Tailwind CSS. It tells me, hey, this is no longer being applied. We are instead utilizing what's inside of index CSS and changing it to 2 vmin. Did that
Sweet.
answer? Okay,
That clarifies it. Thank you.
awesome. Juan?
Kind of a similar question. When do we know when we're going to want to use Tailwind over CSS? Like, is
So
there at least a general rule of thumb? Is what I was kind of looking for.
I think when it comes to a general rule of thumb is just if Tailwind CSS is not doing what you need, then write your own CSS. I think that would be my rule of thumb there. Like if you're trying to utilize Tailwind, but if you find yourself struggling with getting an outcome out of Tailwind longer than 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and you know that you can write the CSS yourself inside of those 10 minutes, then at that point the cost isn't worth the juice isn't worth the squeeze, right? Just write your own CSS instead of trying to force it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and then to caveat for that too, would it be then probably better practice not to flood um, your regular Tailwind CSS, putting everything in there, every little minute thing, like even the color, the background color, like simple things you could put in CSS, taking that out and putting it in regular CSS and not in Tailwind, so you don't have a super long, I guess like function class name or whatever it's called.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that definitely makes sense. Not compiling it or making it super extreme, right? The other thing that comes with design is in the industry, when it comes to majority of design, there's going to be a designer that makes each individual page, and that designer is going to give you specifically, hey, this background has to be this color, this text has to be this color, and it has to be this height. So you're going to find yourself grabbing what the designer gives you and turning it into CSS yourself rather than utilizing something like Tailwind. So when it comes to minute stuff like that, you're typically going to end up writing it yourself. Awesome. I saw the head nods. All right. Customizing spacing. Oh, thank you for sending that in the questions here. Let's go ahead and take a look so that we can have it. Oh, nice. So it looks like we can add some sort of spacing into how we want this to be interpreted inside of Tailwind. That's pretty cool. Nice. Good find, Owen. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, uh, the last example we're going to go ahead and go into, it's going to be, well, one, I'm going to demonstrate this little pop-up example here because I think it's really nice and useful. But at this point, I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste the code from our curriculum so we could take a look at it. All right, so here is a massive line of code or a massive line of classes where it's position absolute. It is top and left, so we might see it in the upper left-hand corner at 0. Well, actually, it's saying it's in the center of the screen. So here we go with width full, height full. So it's going to be the full length of it's going to be the full width of the screen. It's going to be the full height of the screen. It is flex row. So we're going to see the content of it being from left to right. It's going to say justify center. So content is from left to right, but it's going to center it. We see item center, and it centers it to the bottom of my to the center of my screen. All right. So now if I look at the division, this is a pop-up in the center of the screen. All right. So all it did was first it utilized position absolute. So no matter where I go, this is always going to be there. And then place this division on the upper left-hand corner of my screen. It then took this division and said, your width is going to be the entire view width. and your height is going to be the entire view height. And then utilize display flex with flex direction row, justify content center to bring the content to the center of my screen, and then item center to bring the content in the center of my screen. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding positioning, flex, gaps, or anything else regarding Tailwind CSS? All right, awesome. If no one has any questions, this is going to conclude our portion of Tailwind CSS. I'm going to go ahead and pause our recording here. All right, so we just talked about Tailwind CSS. Tailwind CSS is a utility library, and we saw all the great things that Tailwind does as far as bringing us the ability to be able to develop an application and style it rather quickly when it comes to adding classes instead of having to write all of our CSS ourselves. There is a little bit of a setup process, but honestly, when I think about the setup process, cost to gain ratio, I definitely think that the juice is worth the squeeze for Tailwind. All right, now let's move on into our React application, or excuse me, our React Bootstrap application. So here's our Bootstrap application. This also hasn't been installed. So let's go ahead and run that first command of npm install. It's going to install our good old Bootstrap here. All right, once Bootstrap, or excuse me, once our project has been installed, now we want to actually install Bootstrap. So I'm going to come over to Bootstrap. I'm going to go to getting started, and let's just go to the straight introduction. Oh, let's see, theming, color, maybe we go here. There you go. So get started, Bootstrap. It's not it. Oh, here it is. I apologize. I was missing that. All right, so here's Bootstrap. And here's how it works, right? So first, we're just going to run good old npm install react-bootstrap. And just so everyone knows, Bootstrap is not just a React thing. There is also just regular Bootstrap, which you can apply to HTML documents. All right, so you can utilize HTML documents as well to just apply Bootstrap. But somebody said, hey, you know what? I wish I had these HTML documents available for me in Bootstrap. So someone created the React Bootstrap. And that's how we get here. All right, so now that we have React Bootstrap, the next thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that we import this style sheet here. So I'm going to copy this link for import Bootstrap. /this /bootstrap /min. You can go into source. Going to come over to main.jsx. I'm going to add this import statement right before index.css. All right, now I'm going to come to app.jx, or excuse me, I'm going to go to app.css, remove all of the styling that is in there. Remove all the styling that is in index.css, and I'm going to render my application here. Let's go ahead and go to h1. Hello, Yankee. All right. Oh, I don't think I actually installed it. There you go. All right. So it's been installed by utilizing the command that we saw up above. I then grab this link here, which is going to grab the Bootstrap style sheet. And I added that to main.jsx. Well, now let's run the division, or let's actually run the development server. So I'm going to do npm run dev. The development server starts running, and we see that it says hello Yankee. Well, even now, the font is a little bit different. All right, we installed Bootstrap and everything's coming from Bootstrap. I didn't change anything, but we do have a little bit of a different font styling than the one that comes from regular from our regular browser. If I comment this out, here's the regular H1 tag, right? But because I have Bootstrap installed, we get a little bit of a fancier font or some fancier text. Now, this is called a component library, meaning that I can go into Bootstrap, go into my source folder, and create components. For example, one of my favorite components is the modal. So inside of Bootstrap, or inside of components, excuse me, I can go ahead and make my, oh, hello, my modal dot JSX and code my modal dot JSX. All right, so there's my modal. I can come over to Bootstrap, take a look at the different components, and you can see here that they have modals. Modals are essentially just pop-ups that come up. Here's a live demo of how they work. So here's a static backdrop. There's one without animation. Here's one that's vertically centered. I like this one. So I'm just gonna go ahead and copy this code, bring it in. And it gives me a little bit of a setup. It says, hey, you are going to want this of React reuse state equals to false inside of your actual application. So I'm gonna take that, bring it over to app. All right, so there's my show. It tells me, hey, this should also belong in app. So I'm going to take that, bring it over to app. And then finally it says, hey, this right here should also be demonstrated in app.jsx. All right. So there's the modal. And I see a question come up. Let me finish demonstrating this and I'll open it up for questions. And then we have my vertical modal here, which I'm just going to change to my modal. Notice how we're already importing a button here. This button should be imported inside of app.jsx because as of right now, button doesn't exist. And then we have this modal property. Modal takes in props, it does its whole thing, and we want to export default a modal. Or excuse me, this is my modal. All right, so now we created the component, everything's being exported. We're trying to utilize it inside of app.jsx. Well, we just need to import. We need to import my modal from components, my modal. All of the functionality has already been created for us. We can see the set show state here where it's going to change it to true. It then passes it down to the modal as a prop where it's called show. So once it changes to true, it will actually show the modal. And then we can see this on hide. It's going to change this attribute back to false. So show will turn to false. We go to our V application. It looks like we have an error. So let's take a look at what we have here. My vertical modal is not defined. Oh, here you go. Let's try it again. Button is not defined. Yes, it is. What are you talking about? Is that in my modal? Am I utilizing a button? Yes, I am. I'm utilizing a button in my modal. So let me refactor that as well. All right, there it is. It's finally showing. I'm gonna refresh it. Gonna exit. When I click, it populates the modal. We can see all the functionality working. I can click on the outside and that will hide it. Once it hides, it changes that property back to false, which causes my modal to actually go away and now be displayed. All right, and that's just the general steps for React Bootstrap. let me go ahead and open it up for questions before we do a separate demonstration. Let's hear from Owen.
What so in your mymodal.jsx, it takes in the argument of props. Where's that coming from?
Yeah, that's a great question. So props is essentially everything that's coming in from app.jsx. So app.jsx is passing down show and on hide. When you pass it down that way, essentially what happens inside of the function is it creates something called props, right? And props is then essentially a dictionary, or excuse me, an object that has a key value pair of show to show or modal show, and on hide, which is set modal show. Right, so those are the two functions that are happening there that are being passed as prompts to my modal. So when we saw the example of passing down props earlier, what we did is we went into my modal, and instead of utilizing the spread operator like they do here, we actually just do, hey, I want to see on hide. Right, and instead of spreading props, we actually just did show is equal to show. And then we did on hide is equal to on hide. And then finally down here, we call the on hide function on click. Right, so I can click it, it shows me my modal, and I can exit. So it's exactly the same thing. We're just doing object destructuring in this case, or we could just reference the entire object by calling props.
So essentially, you're just putting the keys into as your arguments, so then it can interpret the values of that object.
Exactly.
That's,
So
that's what those props are. Okay.
yeah, it just puts them inside of an object that we reference to as props.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Awesome. Juan?
Sorry, I think I missed it. When you were beginning to import this, or well, copy the code over and then put the modal in, you started saying, okay, this, it's telling us to put this into over here and this over there. How'd you know what to move from where?
Yeah.
I think I missed that.
So if we come back to the modals page, here we have the actual vertical modal function, all right, which has all of the information regarding the modal itself. But if we scroll down to the bottom, it gives us function app. So it's saying, hey, the parent of wherever this modal is supposed to go off, not necessarily always going to be function app, but the parent of where this modal is going to be triggered should have the following. It should have this use state, and it should have these buttons, along with calling the modal itself. Right, so React Bootstrap's layout actually does a pretty good job of letting us know where things should be separated in a child-to-parent relationship.
Is there any reason why you deleted the React dot use state false? You deleted the React before use state.
Yes, so the main reason why I deleted the React before use state, if we can take a look at the import statements up above. So here they're not importing use state from React, right? Instead, they're calling the entire React file and then grabbing use state. Well, the way we do it here is we import use state from React so that we could just utilize use state later on as a regular function. So it's just a separate way of doing imports. Since we had already imported it, I didn't see a reason to reference the entire React sheet to then grab the use state function. Does that answer your question, James? I see thumbs up. Awesome. Of
Yes, thank you.
course. All right. Any other questions? Let's hear it, Gary.
Would you mind sharing the mymodal.jsx and the app.jsx?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, both of those have been shared in the Yankee Questions channel. Oh no, I didn't share it properly the second time. Let me edit that message. There you go. Now we have quick blocks. All right. Great. So there's one example of modals. Let's take a look at what else React Bootstrap has to offer and try to tie it into some of our other examples that we've seen. So currently, I'm going to go ahead and use this back directory here. I'm going to install Axios just so I can make some requests. And we're going to go ahead and implement a little bit of a third-party API integration here. Let's bring in the Pokey API again. All right, so I'm going to go back to React. And what I want to do is I want to create a form where users can ask for a specific Pokemon. So I'm just going to come over, look at the different forms that they have. I see that they have form controls. Here's some input stuff. Okay, everything seems pretty, they even have files. That's great. So there's a little bit of there's a lot of information here and a little bit of nuances. Let's see what else we have. Let's see, it shows form text. That looks pretty good. Let's see. Layouts, grid, breakpoints. Where's an overview? Here it is. So in overview, they have an entire sign up form that you can utilize. That's great. All right, let's start utilizing this React Bootstrap here to create our form. So I'm going to go ahead and run with import form from React Bootstrap dash form. So that's going to bring in my form. Then I'm going to go ahead and open up a form. This will have a form dot control, which will be of type text. And it will have a, let me take a look at our forms here just so that I can ensure. So we have a form group. So there's form group. All right. And then it has a button type submit. Great. So let's do a button. This is type submit. And then I can import Axios as well. All right. Let's take a look at the Vite server. Here's our look for Pokemon form there. Great. We can see that the form is pretty much stretched out. All right. I see we have a question. Go ahead, Owen.
Yeah, where for your app.jsx, where did you get the form.control? That was, I know it's in the modal, but how did you know to put that there?
Yeah, great question. So we have form, right? And control comes from within form. The reason I knew why to put that there is because I looked at the different examples that they have here. And it looks like they have everything wrapped in a form. So if I come up here to the example, they have everything wrapped in a form. And then they have things called form groups. So if I wanted to label this, I could turn this into a form group and add a label. But I noticed that for all of the input types, they have a form.control and then type. And that's when you specify what kind of input it is that you want to receive. Here they have a text as well. So it looks like even for colors, which I'm assuming it's going to be form.control or type color, which should be here at the bottom. So here we have form.control type color. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
All right. All right. So now we have our button, we have our form. Now let's set a little bit of functionality here. So let's say const user input set user input. We could make this equal to a use state of an empty string. All right, so up to this point, we're essentially working with an input form. We're utilizing a use state. How do I capture the user's input whenever they type into this form control?
You could set an on change listener for.
All right, so an unchanged that will be triggered on the event. And what it will do is it will set user input to event.target.value. All right, let's see what that does. We're going to come over to Vite. And let's do an inspect here. How could I see the current value of user input in my console? Is there a way that I could console.log the current value of the state of user input?
You could just put an element inside, like beneath the hello Yankee, just put a H2 and bracket user input.
Okay, yeah, we could do that. What else could I do?
Use the user effect or use effect.
Nice, let's do a use effect. All right, so we have a use effect, and this use effect will console log user input every time user input changes. All right, so my first argument is the function. The second argument is my dependency list. All right, let's take a look at the console now. We refresh it, we type into it, we back tab. So it looks like it's working. All right, so everything is working great. The one thing that I would like to add here, which doesn't seem to be necessary, but I want us to continue this common practice, always set the value of a user of the input to user input. Sometimes you get some misbehavior from React if you don't do this step. So please make sure that you're adding the value attribute to user input as well. It's not going to change the proper behavior, right? Like this is working correctly. But this is just ensuring that what's being displayed here is actually what user input is being set to. All right. So now we were able to capture the user input. So now could I utilize Axios to send a request to the Poke API to have all of a Pokemon's information?
You'd want to set another hook for your button to where on click so you'll set an event listener on your button for on click, and you create another hook to do something to where it uses your user input, then to create a GET request for that API.
All right, awesome. So I noticed you said that we want to utilize an on-click, but this button is a type submit. Do I want to create an on-click, or is there a different event handler that I want to add?
Submit. My bad.
Awesome. So let's go ahead and add an on submit method here. And let's just call this get Pokemon info and pass in the event. All right. So now let's go ahead and start passing this off. Let's hear it from Sean. Sean, how could I start creating this function that will send an Axios request on an on submit method to grab a Pokemon's information?
Sorry, I don't know where to start.
All right, no problem.
You could set the data and the response to await axios.get and then type in the URL. I guess you could create a function or define the get Pokemon info. Yeah. And then you'll Yep, axios.get, and then put the URL in, and then you can, oh, wait, backticks. And then after that, you can put in, you can take out ditto and then type in, change that out for the user input. That way it'll grab whatever they type in. And then you'll also need,
Demi, you're doing great, but I'm gonna pass it off so that we can get some more.
oh.
We're killing it. That's awesome. All right. Let's go ahead and pass it off to someone. Let's see. Let's hear from James Cromer. What's next?
Do you need your text? No, sorry. Do we need to pass like the E event into the function at all?
Yes, we do. Awesome. Let's go
Okay.
ahead and get that into the function. All right. And what do I do with that event? Why is it important that I pass this onSubmit method into the onSubmit function?
That I don't think I know.
So it would only trigger when the event
It's-
occurs?
All right. Awesome. And Haley, how do we do that? How do we make it so that it only triggers a specific behavior that we want and not a default behavior?
Can't you use the prevent default?
Perfect. Yeah. So we're doing e.prevent default. All right. So now we prevented the default behavior from the onSubmit form. We're sending a request to grab information. Jacob?
Oh yeah, I just had a quick question. It was the prevent default behavior. As far as like await goes, that's only when we use Axios, correct? Like when doesn't await kind of do like the same thing, sort of like it's awaiting actually fetching the stuff, or am I getting ahead of myself?
Uh,
I'm
You're
trying to I'm trying to refresh myself on like await and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, you're definitely not getting yourself ahead of yourself. I think you're right. We are utilizing an event. The prevent default is stopping the form submission from like re-rendering our entire application.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But the await comes if we were to create an asynchronous function.
Gotcha.
If this is not an asynchronous function, so we wouldn't utilize await,
Okay, yeah, I remember. Thank you.
of course. All right, Owen,
Why are we not utilizing an asynchronous function?
we can utilize an asynchronous function. Would we like to utilize an asynchronous function?
I think so.
All right, let's do that. Let's turn this into an asynchronous function. So there's our async. And let's hear it from Ryan. Ryan, well, since I'm utilizing an asynchronous function, how would I send this request now?
Well, first, I think doesn't the axios.get need to be sent to like a variable like const response or something like that?
So let's do let response is equal to,
And then await in front after that.
perfect. We will utilize await because now we're waiting for a response. Nice.
Yep.
So now we have the response. So now how do I log the data of this Pokemon into my console?
Just be, oh, go for it.
Console.log response.data because it's already in JSON.
Perfect. So console.log response.data because it's already in JSON. All right. Go ahead, Gary.
Can we make it responsive to data so that we can just pass data through the console log?
Yeah, we definitely can. We could do, hey, I just want to grab the data attribute out of this object that gets returned in the response. And I don't care about the headers or everything else that's inside of my response. I just want data. So I'm utilizing object destructuring. This is returning an object, and I'm saying the only thing that I want is the key of data. So I just want these values in here. So now when I console.log data, we should be able to see it in our console. Let's take a look at what we have. All right, so I say hello, and I backtrack hello. All right, let's go ahead and type in Charizard in there. And I'm just gonna press enter because that should look for the Pokemon. Great. So we submitted this form. Once the form was submitted, the default behavior of the form was prevented. We can see up here that there's no question mark. So it was never actually re-rendered. All right. The form then sent a request utilizing Axios to the Poke API with Charizard. Once this came back, we only grabbed the data attribute out of the response, which is all of this JSON gibberish that we see down here. Right, we could view it in raw JSON. This is all we're working with within the Poke API. And then we log it into our console. All right. Awesome. And let's take it a step further here. I'm going to actually take over just because I want to show off this nice little thing called cards. I really like this card thing. I like using it in a lot of my components. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new component here. Call it Poke card.jsx and paste it. This is going to take in Pokemon. And it's just going to be a Poke card that's being exported. Here I'm going to render Pokemon name. For the image, the source for the image should be Pokemon dot sprites dot front default. And we know this from the Poke API, right? If we take a look at the Poke API, data passes down the attribute of name somewhere. Where is this attribute? Let's see, where'd you go? Here it is. So here's the attribute of name. Then we have sprites, which we can also pass down and take a look at front default. All right. And I don't really need this button, nor do I need this text for the body. That's all I want to see. All right. Well, now inside of app.jsx, what I can do is I can create a use state for a Pokemon. So const, I'm just going to call it selected Pokemon. Say set selected Pokemon. I'm going to say this is equal to a use state of null, because when the first render, it's not going to exist, right? Then I could just, instead of console.logging, I can set selected Pokemon to the data of that Pokemon response. And finally, I could render it. I can say, hey, if there is a selected Pokemon, I want to render Poke card where Pokemon is equal to selected Pokemon. And otherwise, in the case that there isn't a selected Pokemon, I don't want you to return anything. All right, so there's my line of code. If there is a selected Pokemon, render the Pokemon card. If there isn't, don't render anything. Well, let's take a look here. We utilize Charizard. We look for the Pokemon. And we get a nice little Charizard card that populates that has the image of Charizard with a nice title under it. We could change it. We could look for Ditto. And then we get Ditto showing up. We could look for Pikachu. And so on, right? So there's the full cycle over everything we've learned. We've utilized Axios, we've utilized a form, and we are also utilizing an asynchronous function. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding the capability and limitations of React Bootstrap? All right, let's hear from Jacob.
Yeah, I just wanted a quick recap. So when you're getting the user input in the text box, that's in the on submit, correct? Okay. And then as far as it tracking like in the console, that was from, where was that from again? Like when it's actually tracking what you're typing in? Okay, gotcha. The use effect. Gotcha. Cool. Thank you. Just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, no problem at all. All right, Owen.
Can you go back to the PokeCard.jsx?
Yes.
So with your, not your argument, your prop Pokemon, is that's obviously coming from the JSON. Is that just literally just the Pokemon key? So now can you just walk through that prop with me or for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So currently we're grabbing all of our data from the Poke API. So we're just getting a massive object, right? And we're setting that to selected Pokemon. Now, once a selected Pokemon exists, we go into our Poke card and we created an argument, or we created a key value pair here, right? Where the key is Pokemon and the value is the data response that came back from the Poke API, right? So in Poke card, I am grabbing the Pokemon. So I can say, hey, in Pokemon dot, which is the equivalent of saying inside of this data, dot sprites, there is a front default key. We can see it right here. And then we have Pokemon dot name, which is right here. And so that's all we're doing. This key per se comes from my naming convention of naming it Pokemon here on line 40.
Thank you.
Of course.
How is it grabbing that name without using moves first? Because don't name fall under moves, just like front default falls under sprites?
That's a great question. Yeah, so if we take a look at the object here, moves is actually collapsed. So moves is an array of 131 items. If I open up moves, then we get an array of objects. But name is not nested within any other key. It's a surface level key.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Of course. James?
Could you re-explain the difference between the prevent default and the like async await? Because when you redid it with the get Pokemon info with async and await, do we still need the prevent default? Is that the same? Do we need both of them in this context, or what's even the difference between them? I'm getting confused with those.
Absolutely. So the event prevent default has nothing to do with the request, right? So the request itself is independent of the event. The event has to do with the fact that we are utilizing a form, right? The default behavior of a form is that it will send a request to re-render the entire application with the specific arguments that we just submitted, right? Well, we don't want that to happen because we're making a single page application. Not only that, but we would lose all of our state variables if we re-render the application. So in order to stop it from re-rendering, we utilize this event prevent default, which says, hey, do not re-render my application. All right, so that's what this prevent default is going to do. Regardless whether you're utilizing async or not, if you are utilizing a form and it's within React and it's a single page application and you do not want to lose all of your state variables, you need to prevent the default behavior of the form. Now,
When sorry, when is the? I guess we just haven't really seen yet because we're doing really more basic stuff when we might not want that default
oh,
to
gotcha.
occur.
Yeah, let's go to take a look at what happens if we take
Right.
off default. All right. So we take off the prevent default. Let's re-render. So here we've re-rendered our application, and let's inspect in our inspector tools what our console says. So our console currently has two messages of an empty string. If I type in A, we can see that A shows up. Well, let's see what happens when I add Charizard. So now I have Charizard, and notice that my user input, which is a state, is tracking that we have Charizard, right? Well, let's click on look for Poke. Well, my user state is gone. My search bar is now empty, and my console.log is telling me, this is coming from line 18. So this is saying that our selected Pokemon or the user input, excuse me, is now an empty string again. Well, what happened to everything that I typed in? Where did that go? Well, because the application re-rendered, because I submitted a form, therefore the application sent a request to the browser or to the server for HTML document again. Well, it rendered the entire HTML document, but that means that when everything gets re-rendered, this useState function starts again from top to bottom, or this entire rendering starts again from top to bottom. So whatever the user typed in is now gone. All right, we're losing our state variables. So this event prevent default stops that from happening. All right, now if I go ahead and type in, oh, excuse me, let me get rid of that question mark there. There you go. Now, if I go ahead and type in Charizard and I submit my form, well, now Charizard actually populates, and notice how Charizard is still on my bar and still within the console, meaning I never re-rendered my entire application. Does that make sense, James?
Yeah, I think it does. Why is that the default then? That seems kind of interesting that it would default to some weird function or that it would just like clear everything like that.
Because when HTML and everything was first created and the forms were first created, there wasn't such a thing as single page applications. Right? That didn't come until we started messing around with frameworks like React and everything else. All right, awesome. Juan?
Yes, we're mainly messing with this stuff in React. How about CSS for furthering styling the stuff like the cards and all that stuff? Are we gonna go into that, or is that not really possible with React? What is it, Bootstrap?
This is Bootstrap, yes.
Yeah.
We definitely still style it. We could change some components inside of it and change some of the styling. We could give it some ID attributes. So if I were to inspect here, we can see that even though I'm utilizing card, it does have a class, right? So this is a card image top, but here's the class of card. And we can take a look at the computed styles. Let me open that up a little bit. So the computed styles of card, it has this BS card. Here we go. So we can see that it's position relative, display flex. It has flex direction column. Well, maybe we want to change that. All right, so let's grab that card. I can come over to my index.css and say, hey, I want to change card to have a flex direction of row. All right, so here's the original card right under, but now the flex direction of column is being crossed out, and now I have a flex direction of row. And it changed it from left to right rather than top to bottom. Right, so I can still dissect this. I can look for what it is that React Bootstrap is actually rendering, and it's still just rendering classes. They're just nested inside of those components. If I find those classes and I find the styling that I want to change, I could just change it utilizing the same class and overriding its value. I could also give components an ID and then overwrite whatever CSS that Bootstrap is doing with that ID. Did that answer your question, Juan?
Yes, thank you. The only other thing is, for Bootstrap, then it would be the usefulness comes when you're using templates and then just manipulating small things to then make it a little bit more unique, as opposed to really big changes with Tailwind. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, I want to say yes. Like that would be the most efficient way to look at it, right? Like I'm getting the most bang for my buck out of React Bootstrap, and then I could just change small things, right? Tailwind CSS is more, hey, here's all these tools, you build it yourself. Like have fun building it. I think the main difference is how much accessibility you have, right? When you're utilizing something like Tailwind CSS, it's giving you all the tools or all the sticks to build a house, and you could build a house however you want. You can mutate it in whichever way. At some point, Bootstrap is going to stop you, or it's not going to be able to be manipulated in certain ways that you want it to, or the juice may not be worth the squeeze to even try to figure out how to maybe get this border to open up a little more or have some more padding inside of it. So I think that's the difference, right? So Bootstrap gives you a brick house and says if you want to change stuff, you can, but you're looking at superficial changes. Whereas Tailwind CSS is here's all the material, you build your own house and make it look however you want it to look. All right. Any other questions regarding utility versus component libraries?
Could you just, sorry, could you just give an example? Like, obviously you're gonna have your own preferences, but example of where you'd use Tailwinds versus Bootstrap with utility versus component. Like, would you rather use Bootstrap for, like, say you have a button that's going to take you to not another page, but like completely change your screen? Would that be useful to where it's like it's already structured to a certain way? Or
Mm.
like,
I
kind of
think
super in depth on that question, way more than I intended.
I think I understand your question. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a blanket statement for saying in this situation, choose one or the other. I think it's more of, let's say you're working and someone tells you, hey, we need you to make a front end for this application. We don't need it to look super pretty, but we do want it to look presentable for the client. And we're going to show this demonstration to the client like in 3 days. In that case, I would probably just use Bootstrap the entire time, right? I would grab all my components from Bootstrap, copy and paste, and there you go. And then afterwards, I would go back and probably slowly defactor that Bootstrap, take away more and more Bootstrap, and start implementing more Tailwind CSS or more utility library rather than utilizing everything that comes from Bootstrap to make it look even more dynamic and more unique for the client. Does that answer your question, Owen?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah, the way I like to think of these is more of a time perspective, right? And also just how exactly it is that you want your website to look. If you want it to look super pretty, then probably Tailwind will be the best approach. If you're just going for efficiency and speed, then Bootstrap will give you the most bang for your buck. All right, I'm not seeing anything else in Yankee questions. So I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording here.